Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Today on MythVision, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Daniel B. Glover. Is it Glover or Glover?
Glover.
I always look, man, I'm going to tell you right now, I am the worst when it comes to pronouncing names. I try to correct myself all the time. So Dr. Daniel B. Glover is joining us today, one of the rising stars in New Testament studies. Dr. Glover is assistant professor of New Testament at Lee University School of Theology and Ministry. Let me show him on the screen here. Where he has recently awarded the 2025 Excellence in Scholarship Award, the highest honor for faculty research and writing. Dr. Glover's expertise lies in the study of ancient Mediterranean religion, deification, early Christianity, and philosophy. He's an active member of the Society of Biblical Literature and the Enoch Seminar, and his scholarship has earned international recognition, including innovations to present at major conferences in the United States and abroad. He's the author of two groundbreaking monographs, Patterns of Deification in the Acts of the Apostles, and his latest, which we're going to discuss today, Jesus and Other Sons of God, Luke's Christology and Mediterranean Myth. In this new work, Dr. Glover explores how Luke's gospel situates Jesus within the broader world of Greco-Roman mythology, comparing him to demigods, heroes, and divine men, the very thing we love to do here at MythVision. He shows that Luke's audience would have recognized Jesus' miraculous conception, resurrection, and ascension as part of the same cultural discourse of divinity and deification that shaped their understanding of gods and heroes. This book challenges us to see Luke not in isolation, but as a creative voice in a vibrant ancient conversation about what it means to be divine. It's my privilege to welcome Dr. Daniel B. Glover to MythVision. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm happy to join you today, and you really did your research on that introduction there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, look, your book speaks for itself as I've been reading it. So I kind of, I feel like we're doing the appetizer to a really good course meal here. And I'm hoping this appetizer does lead people to consider getting a copy of your work, which they can get on Amazon. I've got the link pinned, but also it's in the description. I love this book. I love how it opens, but I'm also, truth be told, biased. I love mythology. I love legend. I love, like an anthropologist is digging for fossils, I love to see the evolution, the development, and I like to get to the source, right? I like to find out what is the cause or what is something behind the something. I used to think that this was like, truth be told, all transparency, I was a fundamentalist, right? So that's a radically different world in my mind than the one I now look at and go, wow, here are the building blocks to what made or crafted the very stories I cherished so deeply and loved for so long. And of course, I still love them, but of course I have a different kind of relationship with them than I once did. And so be sure to get a copy of his book. I swear on it. I'm telling you, it's covering excellent scholarship, name drops many great names: Robin Faith Walsh, Richard C. Miller, Dennis R. MacDonald, academics that I'm very prevalent and a bias toward. I love their work. I think that more of that observation needs to be brought in to balance out the problem we see in the field, in my opinion. Go to academia, follow him on academia. And of course, you can do the research by finding him at Lee University website as well, which is where I learned that he got awarded and things like that. So anyway, now you know where I got my story from. So if I may, you mind if I call you Daniel during this interview?
Please do. Yeah.
Excellent. Why write the book?
That's a good question. The book really had its germination in my doctoral defense. When I'm defending the dissertation before my committee, I wrote my dissertation on the Acts of the Apostles and the various deification scenes that occur in that. And when you're doing a doctoral defense, you usually have like 4 or 5 different readers. My second reader, he asked me, well, where's the first volume? Where's the stuff about Jesus? And I said, well, Bruce, it's this book's already pretty long. I don't know that I could have gotten to all that. And he said, well, you should really think about doing a first volume, especially in light of the kinds of things that I end up saying in the final chapter of my dissertation about Paul and his shipwreck on the island of Malta. And so I sat on that idea for probably a year, just thinking it through. How would I write a book like this? And after about a year, I had enough thoughts pinging around in my head that I just couldn't keep it inside anymore. I had to just start writing. And the more I wrote, the more connections that I saw with Luke's ancient Mediterranean literary culture. And it ended up becoming the book that we have today. So I think I started really not with the birth of Jesus like I do in the book, but I started with the transfiguration scene. What's going on there? Why is Jesus turning into light? Why is he appearing with people who are supposed to be dead or ascended into heaven? And why is Peter trying to make tents? And this took me very quickly to the similar scenes in the book of Acts where Jesus glows and appears as light in front of Paul. And the most obvious comparand for these scenes is a Greco-Roman epiphany. It looks an awful lot like a god has appeared to a human being. When they do that, they're usually large, dangerous, and bright. And Jesus ends up being those kinds of things. And so this led me down the path that produced the book. And my hope is that, not that it'll change the field entirely. I don't expect it to do that. Other scholars who are better than me have prepared the way for that, including the ones you've mentioned a moment ago, Dr. Walsh, Dr. Miller, and Dr. McDonald, among others. But I'm hoping that this will bring attention to the broader Mediterranean world to New Testament studies, especially those Greek and Roman literary sources that are often neglected in favor of just Jewish sources. Jewish sources are really important for understanding the New Testament. They're indispensable for understanding the New Testament, but they're not the only culture that goes into the creation of the New Testament. So that's my hope for the book.
You did a fantastic job. I feel like, again, we have extremes, right? And then you have extremes, purely Jewish. Let's only look for Jewish. And then you're trying to go, look, let's go in the middle here. Hold on. There's more. Now, I do think that when what you're doing is going to correct it, it's still going to bring in a lot of weight that comes from sources that I think a lot of more conservative Christian circles are going to be like, we can't touch those because they already have these bias that come in. That's like those Justin, right? There's demonic. There's something not good about it. But the way you unraveled that is similar to how when I read Miller's book, Resurrection and Reception, he opens the case with Justin. And I think you did a great job starting with that. So let me frame it this way, because I kind of wrote up some of my questions here before we did this interview. You start the book, and I should actually pull up the images that I was showing you before the stream. You start the book, and that's Jesus on your front cover of your book, which, of course, this is the actual image of the art that's on your book. So my question is, you start the book with clear images of Hermes, Theseus, and Jesus with, is this Hermes? No, this is Jesus, right?
Yeah, Jesus, yeah.
That's right. So you start the book, this is Jesus, just to show a little zoomed out, and of course a different angle that's in the catacombs you talk about in your book. But you're using images of Hermes, Theseus, and Jesus, with Jesus's humanity and divinity likened to these well-known conceptions in the Mediterranean world. Hermes being purely divinity, whereas Theseus being a demigod figure, mortal, but also is divinized. There's another one of Jesus, and then we get to another modern conception of the Good Shepherd, which they're all Good Shepherd type scenes. Here is one from a fresco from Pompeii of Theseus after he defeats the centaur, which is in the bottom left there. And I'm just giving some artistic stuff. Heracles, that's irrelevant to what we're doing here. Hermes, of course. Hermes, and these are old. You could see there's the little ram type goat. Of course, this is an old, likely Hermes, but this is a calf instead of a goat. There's another Hermes, which I think, based on the style of the shoes and stuff, gives that Greco-Roman feel, likely Roman era. But and then another really old one of Hermes with his winged sandals. So, okay, enough of me asking that. But like, why'd you start here? What's going on with that?
Yeah. So the very beginning of the book, I can't remember if it's a preface or forward, but whatever comes before the first chapter, I talk about the cover. I sort of exegete the cover of the book. And the cover of the book is that first image that you showed. It's a catacomb painting in the catacomb of Priscilla of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. But I think that little bit of confusion that you showed a moment ago, where, well, is this Jesus? Is this Hermes? I'm not quite sure. And that's what the art sort of does for us, is it causes us to ask, well, is this Jesus or is this Hermes? Well, we know it's Jesus because of where it appears, right? It appears in a Christian catacomb where Christian artwork surrounds it and is on a number of the other walls and on the ceiling. But if we take it away from its context, if we take it out of that catacomb, what are we looking at? And it's not entirely clear, because the image of this quote unquote good shepherd looks an awful lot like images that we would associate with Hermes in the first century. That is, that Jesus is carrying on his shoulders as the good shepherd. Interestingly, not a sheep, but he's actually carrying a goat, which is kind of interesting. So a horned animal here. It's not a sheep, which is what you would expect the shepherd to be carrying. And so that's the first sign to me that something's going on here. But second, as I looked into this painting, just in my spare time, one of the things that I noticed is it looks an awful lot like not just Hermes. It also looks a lot like Theseus as well. There's this famous image of Theseus having slain the Minotaur in Pompeii, where Theseus is standing in a very similar posture. He's got a similar expression, similar haircut, all kinds of similarities between the two. And my point is not ultimately that whoever painted that is deliberately imitating these two or any two images. But what they are doing is painting Jesus in a way that resembles both gods and demigods from the ancient world. We could even have added into this mix, and I didn't just for the sake of clarity, but we could add into this mix Orpheus, who is also well known for carrying goats. And so there are a number of different divine sort of figures and people that are associated with Jesus in this artistic depiction. And if artists can do this to convey something about Jesus, right? Why would they be painting Jesus in the likeness of Hermes or of Theseus or of Orpheus or anyone like that? Well, probably to say something about that individual, that Jesus is not just some ordinary guy. He's not just some ordinary shepherd. In fact, he's like a god, and maybe like those specific gods. And so I wanted to open the book with this sort of image, because it gives us a picture of what it's like to try to communicate something about Jesus in a medium other than just making propositional statements about him, like Jesus is a god or Jesus is a man. Those are propositional statements. Paintings don't do that, and neither does Luke. Luke is likewise a kind of literary artist, and he's trying to portray Jesus in a particular kind of light. And that kind of light that I want to argue in the book is like other kinds of gods. Jesus is like Heracles. Jesus is like Hermes in some ways. Jesus is like Protesilaus in Philostratus's Heroicus. He's like these divine kinds of figures in very particular kind of ways. So my argument is ultimately that Luke is putting those likenesses to theological use. He's trying to use them to say something theological. He's using them for religious and ideological purposes too. And the closer we study it, the better we can come to know what Luke is trying to do in the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts.
Yeah, that's important. Your book kind of highlights this art from 3rd and 4th centuries, which someone might go, well, that's late. Okay. But then you take the debate right to Trypho and Justin. And of course, I'd like to kind of ask this question in relation to that. You turn to Justin Martyr versus Trypho, where scholars may suggest Trypho may be a fictive debate partner representing Jewish objections to Christianity at that time. Some suppose Trypho is a stand-in for a 2nd century rabbi named Tarpon. The disputes they have in Justin's writings wrestle over whether Christians, well, here's some of the debates. Whether Jesus is the Messiah prophesied in the Hebrew scriptures, the validity of the law of Moses after Christ, resurrection, circumcision, Sabbath, and Christian identity versus Jewish identity. For Justin, Christianity is the true Israel. For Trypho, Christianity is a mistaken breakaway that misuses scripture. And you say in your book, I might as well share the image of this actually, so people can see the quote a little better. I love this, man, by the way. Wading here into dangerous territory, I would like to wax psychological for a moment. Justin probably thought his only recourse to defend the uniqueness of Jesus' divine sonship was to call into question these literary and religious parallels. But that is a hard task, in spite of whatever impressions recent biblical scholarship on the issue might offer. Undoubtedly, then Justin found himself unable to dispute that the stories of Jesus and the other gods did show a certain familiarity. And he admits as much elsewhere. And I think you're referring to Apology 21, where we believe nothing different from the things you suppose about, Hermes, the Logos, the whole nine. These are very important texts, I think, early on that indicate what you're talking about. But Justin noticed that the origin of those parallels remain open to question. Justin begins by assuming Jesus is uniquely and singularly the Son of God, the incarnation of the organizing divine principle known as the Logos, who reveals himself in the Holy Scriptures. In such a case, the origins of the parallels must be deceptive. The Son existed prior to the other gods, so his divinity cannot be derivative of theirs. The proper conclusion to draw from the questions these parallels raise must be that the New Testament authors did not adopt the mythological language of the Greeks. Rather, Justin concludes the reverse. These parallels owe their existence to demons or daimones who correctly read the Old Testament prophecies that spoke these things about the Messiah and then imitated them in advance of their historical fulfillment in Jesus. You did a fantastic job even quoting him where he talks about, the Dionysus thing? Yeah, that's Genesis 49 when Jacob prophesies over his sons. I read that text. I looked at this and I said, okay, I see the grapevine. I see the imagery of grapes. Maybe that's Phoenician. Maybe there is a common source. Maybe there's some common trope that is picked up in both mythologies, but it doesn't look like that would be the origin. You know what I'm saying? It sounds like he's convoluting a little argumentation to win his case. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So Justin's dialogue with Trypho is really interesting for a variety of reasons. But one of those reasons is the way that he rationalizes the ostensible parallels between these Greco-Roman and Christian thoughts. And it is interesting that whether Trypho is a real historical person, whether he is an imitation of a 2nd century Jewish figure, whatever the case, it seems to me that Trypho presents the kinds of objections that Jews would have presented to Christianity in the 2nd century, and if in the 2nd century, probably also the late 1st century. But in any case, I think Luke Acts is a 2nd century composition, so we're well within the lifetime of the author of the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts. And so in the 2nd century, if Jews are going to object to stories of Jesus' birth from a virgin being conceived by God or by God's Spirit, and they're objecting to this on the basis that this sounds pagan, and Justin's argument is not, well, these aren't pagan. He says, yeah, it's pretty much pagan. The problem is they stole it from us. They just knew the predictions in advance. And that's a really clever answer, but it's just not a very convincing answer. Because, as you said, you go back to the biblical text and you see these stories that Justin attributes the Greek demons, looking at and going, aha, yeah, we'll do that before Jesus to beat him to the punch. They just don't sound like they don't sound much like the story of Dionysus. It doesn't sound much like the story of Perseus. And so, putting aside, whether demons would have been good exegetes of the Old Testament to begin with, it's a really fanciful answer, but it's also really revealing, because what he doesn't do is he doesn't question the similarity between the two. He admits, yeah, Trypho, you're right. They do look similar. It's just which one came first. And he wants to say, well, we actually came first and the Greeks came second. The problem is the history there doesn't line up. So he's got to say, okay, well, we came first, but ours was prophesied. And so, again, I think it's a really brilliant answer for a 2nd century apologist. It just isn't going to convince us today. Today, we've got to be a little bit more responsible. We've got to think, okay, what are ancient authors doing when they're writing a text? One of the things ancient authors are trained to do from the start in their early compositional exercises is to imitate older examples of ancient literature. And if we look at the kinds of ancient literature that they're being exposed to, it's all of the classic myths. It's Homer, it's Hesiod, you get Euripides, you get all of those things that we get these myths of Dionysus and Perseus and all of those people that Trypho identifies. So I think Justin's answer is really revealing. It reveals someone who wants to hold on to the uniqueness of Christianity in light of what seems to be a lack of uniqueness, or at least a derivative kind of idea, that it's coming from the Greeks and therefore not Jewish. And if not Jewish, then also problematic for both Trypho and for Justin, as well as some contemporary people.
There's so much you like. Clip that, everybody, by the way. That's good stuff. There's so much that goes on in modern scholarship that you take to task, in a sense. I think politely, you're very respectful in how you did this, pertaining to Bacchum and Lurtado, that they are arguing everything, even divinity and the conceptions of divinity, within only a Jewish model. And Lurtado, you point out, maybe you do a better job explaining the differences here, but from what I understand, Lurtado is willing to try to say some new innovation is happening here, whereas I'm not sure what Bacchum does to this. Maybe you can explain that. But then how you come in with this, with what you're arguing here, corrects it gives us all the building blocks we need to then explain how we could get this guy who is within the Jewish milieu, but yet is, willing and capable of becoming a Trinity even. I mean, like to the level of a Trinitarian theology develops out of this. So can you explain that a little bit of the beef, the debate?
Yeah, absolutely. So the origins of the debate really go back quite a long ways. There was this movement in New Testament scholar called the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule, so the history of religion school in German. And they wanted to trace the origin of early Christianity, how it developed as a religion, and indeed how it developed as a religion in light of all the other religious movements in the world. And they obviously admitted that Christianity is a Jewish development, but they had this very stark Jewish, Gentile, or Hellenistic divide. And they thought that Jews, strictly monotheistic, very, very strong sense of the oneness of God. And so the movement to believe that Jesus was divine had to have happened in the Hellenistic world. And the early 20th century is sort of permeated by people who are looking for just Hellenistic influence on early Christology, including things like Luke's Gospel. But about midway through the 20th century, you have scholars who are saying, well, a lot of this Jewish literature that we now have, that a lot of our predecessors didn't have, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually do provide a lot of good precedents for understanding the way that Jesus could have been conceived of as divine. And Bauckham and Hurtado really find themselves in that new school, which is, as it happens, called the New History of Religion School. They want to argue that no, these Jewish precedents for Jesus' divinity can be found without having to go to a second stage of Greek or Roman religion. You can find, for Hurtado, these traditions of a principal angel, an angel who's above all the rest of creation, who exacts judgments and who sometimes even looks divine by joining God in heaven, sometimes on the throne or something like that, but who's not divine itself. The principal angel is not divine himself. He's just really high up there in the ontological hierarchy. But Hurtado says, but the one difference between the principal angel and Jesus is that Jesus gets worshipped by early Christians. Jews weren't worshiping these principal angels, but Christians were worshiping Jesus. And so he says there's this mutation that happens in early Christianity, early Judaism, when Christianity is still Judaism, that is based, he asserts, on religious experience that causes people to start to worship this principal angel Jesus, not just as a principal angel, but as a God, as not just a God, but the one God. So somehow Jesus gets wrapped into the one identity of God the Father, or the high God. So he asserts that this is a sort of proto-binitarianism. So not quite a trinitarianism, but a binitarianism.
I've heard that, by the way, the constant two powers in heaven stuff. And I'm like, I hear you guys, and I don't want to throw you off of where you're headed with this, but where did the third power come from? Okay. Anyway, I'm just saying, like, I have questions, please.
Right. Yeah. And those are good questions. Bauckham, on the other hand, he says no to a lot of this stuff. He says there aren't these other mediating figures who are being able to do the kinds of things that Jesus is able to do. There's no parallel in the Jewish world for what happens to Jesus. Instead, what we have is a Christology of divine identity. So what ends up happening is not that Jesus is mapped onto some high-ranking being like Hurtado claims, but instead that Jesus is identified as possessing the same identity as the God of Israel. And that we know he has this identity because he does the kinds of things that the God of Israel is able to do. Things like creation, things like sitting on the throne, things like dispensing judgment. And so he argues that on that basis, the New Testament texts present Jesus as divine. The problem, as many scholars have pointed out to this point, is that in a lot of New Testament books, Jesus doesn't do those kinds of things. And Bauckham still thinks Jesus is divine in those texts. And so their categories of divinity don't quite fit what we actually have going on in the New Testament. Bauckham, because the New Testament texts actually don't measure up to the litmus test that he puts them to, and Hurtado, because he's neglecting an entire body of evidence. Not to say that Jesus wasn't portrayed as a principal angel in some texts, or conceived of in that way. Paul certainly seems to speak of Jesus in Galatians. He says likens him to an angel. So it's certainly possible that he's drawing on that idea. But there's a whole world of texts that and a whole world of religion that Judaism exists within. And so my problem with their approach to early Christology is ultimately this, that they keep that dividing line between Judaism and Hellenism, or the broader Mediterranean world, very sharp and distinct by claiming, oh no, the New Testament only employs Jewish precedents for their Christology. The problem is Judaism doesn't exist in a hermetically sealed bubble. They exist in this broader world. And if we look at other Jewish texts, they do very, very syncretistic or Hellenistic kinds of things. You don't have to look far beyond even Josephus doing these sorts of things. Philo does these sorts of things. The kinds of Jews that New Testament scholars cite all the time employ similar categories of deification and divinity that we find in the most Greek and the most Roman writers there are. And so my book just wants to kick those floodgates open and say, we've got a lot more lines of development and tradition that are flowing into this these streams of early Christology, and we ought to listen to what they have to say. I think you're muted.
So I appreciate that. I've noticed that's that issue in a lot of the scholarship, and of course, M. David Litwa, Richard Miller, a lot of these guys have already kind of tackled this whole bifurcation between Jewish and non-Jewish and things. It seems like this debate, even with Trypho and Justin, kind of indicates this when Trypho in his reaction says something like, you Christians are, you quoted him saying, baptizing something, this similar to how Zeus impregnates, the various mortal women in his myths, but in one of them, I think, is the golden shower. And the fact that it seems like Trypho's saying to the Christian Justin, you guys have a story about your Christ the same way the Greeks have their story about, Zeus impregnating the mortal woman. Almost like saying it's the same stuff. You're doing the same stuff, whereas we Jews don't. However, there's that interesting article, I don't know if you've ever read it, Yair Zokovich wrote, called A Strange Biography of Samson. And in it, he goes in and points out that the redactors of the Hebrew Bible in Judges appear to have whitewashed the story where the angel of the Lord, here's this theophany kind of representation, mediator between God and heaven and, his actions on earth, which probably initially was just God, is what he's arguing that it seems like the story indicates, actually personally impregnates the mother of Samson. So there's this God, now angel of the Lord, and Josephus, writing about this story, makes an interesting comment. He says that her husband, and in the story, the husband's the only one named. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but the wife's in the field. She comes back and says, I was visited by the angel of the Lord. And he said some things to me. And he goes, well, next time he comes, come get me. And she comes and gets him when he shows up again. And he comes and he goes, hey, what did you tell my wife the other day? And he says, it's none of your business. And then he's like, well, what's your name? It's none of your business. It's for her to know. And I don't need to tell you my name. Josephus, commenting on this, said he's jealous. There's some other man figure appears to his wife in the field. And then all of a sudden you get the birth narrative of him, saying the Nazarite, don't drink or eat anything from the vine. And of course, don't cut the hair. But the Yair Zokovich says this has been a whitewashed myth where it seems that God actually impregnated her. And then he goes through other language where Eve says, like, I have begotten, or Yahweh, I have begotten a son on behalf of Yahweh or something. And other places where barren women's bosoms are opened by God may hint at a fossil where God actually impregnates the women. However, I can't imagine Trypho or any Jewish author in the 2nd century is picking up on that and saying, hey, here's what's going on. Because Josephus comments he was jealous, but doesn't really comment on the whole thing I just developed. That being said, it's a bit hypocritical, in my opinion, now that we know better,
Mhm.
I think the dichotomy between Jewish and Christian, really, we could start, if we got away from fundamentalism, I think we could start seeing more commonality and say, yeah, your scriptures also have imitations, have things that are in common with the known world around them at the time, So I don't know what rabbit trail I'm taking you on here, but it's in the vein, I think, of this whole ordeal that you're bringing up. And I'm hoping your work penetrates the field in a way that allows them to stop just using models of Jewish, because it feels a bit apologetic to me.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And long ago, Jonathan Z. Smith wrote a book. A lot of Jonathan Z. Smith's titles were weird, and this is one of them. He calls it Drudgery Divine, and it's on like on comparing early Christianity or something like that. And he argues that this use that we find of this Jewish context, of wanting to identify Christianity's emergence exclusively in this Jewish context, he calls it duplicitous. He says, on the one hand, Judaism is used as a buffer. It's used as a way to keep out pagan, Greek, Roman, etc. influence. But on the other hand, as something itself to be transcended, right? So you see that even in the work of Bauckham and Hurtado, right? They want to say, no. We have just Jewish matrices that we can use to explain Jesus' divinity, to explain how he becomes God. But at the same time, you have Bauckham saying, but no other Jewish figure has ever been identified with God in the same way. And you have Hurtado saying, oh yeah, well, it takes an evolution or mutation of this Jewish gene to get Christianity. So Judaism is something that Christianity it keeps it separate from its larger world, but also is something that it's grown out of. Like it is superseded. And I find that strategy especially ever since reading Smith, just problematic. And I haven't been able to read the sources the same way. So plugging Smith's book there, it's a fantastic little read.
Thank you for plugging that. I'm all into learning about this material. There was recent debate in the past year and a half, I think, between online communities, skeptics and Christians, and there was a trending idea from a lot of academics to read Jesus. And I think that this is still the common view. James F. McGrath, I've had on several times, has this view. I know I've heard Dan McClellan argue this stuff when he's reacting to some Christians, and I'm a little sympathetic. Okay, I'm talking about to the Christian side of things on this regard. I'm clearly a critical guy. Okay, everyone knows that about me, and I probably tiptoe and go, Derek, can we have a good conversation and not wade into polemics? Okay, got it. But they often want to read Jesus in a way of like an Ish Elohim, as the category you kind of bring up in your book. Actually, someone brings up, who's the scholar right here. According to Kirk, this literature frequently exalts and idealizes humans, Adam, Moses, the prophets, Israel's kings, the Son of Man, Melchizedek, without ascribing divinity to any of them, by keeping their identity separate from the personhood of God. And oftentimes, I think the Hebrew word for that is Ish Elohim. They're like representatives of God. They do powerful things. Moses splits the waters, but it's really God who does all these things. So they'll read into Jesus these ideas and say he's not God. So they minimize divinity, even in Mark. And I read Mark, man, and I do empathize. I do go, who is this that calms the seas with words? I mean, who other than Yahweh did this, right? According to their own tradition. And I think to myself, well, I get it. I mean, like, I think there is some divinity being perceived here that is beyond just a typical prophet, he's beyond that. That has to be the implication here, it seems, even if the Trinity is a further development down the road. I don't know how much of a further development. M. David Litwood thinks Matthew at the end, when it says baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, may indicate something of, I don't know what your view is on this, of a Trinity. I don't
Mhm.
I don't know, man. We're wading into the theological war right now, but
Mhm.
I empathize with that interpretation, even as a person who doesn't believe these things ontologically.
Mhm.
It seems that that's what these texts are portraying. What are
Mhm.
your thoughts? And I know we're not in Luke yet and Acts, but I'm talking about Mark, man.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I have the same reaction when I read Mark's gospel. When he walks on water, when he calms the storm with a word, when he's transfigured, and ultimately, and we can appeal to Richard C. Miller here, right? When his tomb is found empty, what does that mean? When a tomb is found empty, what it means is that person has become a god. And so I think that Mark is dropping hints all throughout, and then the final conclusion is, "See, told you so. The tomb is empty here." So I think that the problem is that comparative base, right? Is who are we imagining as the readers of these texts? If we're imagining Jews who are self-consciously trying to reject everything they think is non-Jewish, then yeah, I guess maybe we could walk away with Daniel Kirk's reading. But if we imagine a broader audience of people who were Gentiles reading this text, they're going to see in that, oh, that sounds a lot like what I heard growing up about Hercules, about Heracles. That sounds a lot like what I heard about the local hero down the street. And so I find it difficult to believe that these people wouldn't be making these connections. And if Mark or Luke or Matthew or whoever is writing these narratives, then either they were really bad at writing narratives that Gentiles wouldn't, make connections with their broader religious experience, or they probably had those sorts of things in mind. And so I land on the in the second camp there.
You're empathetic with me on this, and I love it, man. I do think there's something more to it than just the basic way I hear a lot of these scholars are trying to look at this. And so we get to, and I know Matthew's not where you focus. You focus on Luke, Acts.
Mhm.
One of my favorite sections, because it's, if there's anywhere that permeates Greco-Roman mythology and like does it on a obvious scale to me,
Mhm.
you get right there. Even in the very opening, I had a brilliant conversation with Mark G. Bilby one time, and he said he recommended an article from a scholar. The one Greek word took me down this rabbit trail, and I was like, oh my goodness, man. I'm talking the swaddling cloth.
Mhm.
Just the term swaddling cloth in Greek.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, yeah, the baby's wrapped in a cloth, guys. Get over it. What's the big deal? It's huge. Go to Aeschylus. Go to that Greek term is only used in these particular areas that when you follow that linguistic, using your terminology and Richard Miller's, that language game, when you follow the language game, you go back to the earlier plays, these divinities like Hermes was wrapped at birth in a swaddling cloth, and that same Greek word is used only for divinities in any of the Greek literature. And so I'm like, okay, you have a signal right here with one word that has a whole body of literature and tradition and history behind it. How much more is there if all I needed to do was see just swaddling cloth and run into this huge rabbit hole?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation that Luke is the most obviously conversant with the Hellenistic world, and that's exactly why I picked Luke and Acts. I mean, partly because Luke, whoever the author was, wrote more of the New Testament than any other. That's one good reason to look at him. But another one is just you cannot deny that the author of the Gospel of Luke was engaging Greco-Roman thought, because you have in Acts 17 Paul going to Athens, dialoguing with the philosophers, quoting their poets, quoting philosophers, and engaging with those ideas. Luke is someone who knows at least some of this kind of material. And if we can start with that presumption that Luke knows some of this kind of material, and then move into, okay, if he knows some of this kind of material, how does the stuff that he writes actually fit into or resist the kinds of deifying motifs that we find within that material, what's the result? And that's the book, right? The result is a close and detailed engagement with his literary culture, which uses specific kinds of literary motifs and conventions and ideas about what it is to be divine in order to characterize Jesus. And so I think starting with Luke, it brings us down that rabbit trail, and we can start to see all kinds of things when we admit that, yeah, maybe he does know some of these Greek and Roman texts that we've just been neglecting in scholarship for the past 50 years or so.
Yeah, there's very few of you that I know of that do it on a grand level. I did have Shelley Matthews on once to talk about Acts, I believe. She comes from the feminist perspectives, which is really interesting to hear different takes, because we dudes are blind to half this stuff, it's our nature, right? There's really cool stuff though that you discover as you unravel it. Have you, just curious, and I haven't gotten all your book digested, which means we have to do a round two. I really hope people will get the book. It's that good. I swear on this. I'm not just saying it, like, it's good. Have you read the article by Mark G. Bilby and Anna Lefter, I butchering the last name, Lefteru, that talks about Orestes?
No, I need to take a look at it.
So they actually show, and I think convincingly, I'd love to get your scholarly opinion to look at this, that Luke Acts is modeling this episode off of the Orestes Iphigenia play, or the myth, where Orestes gets vengeance on his mother with her lover attacking Agamemnon, his dad. And so he's guilty of blood. So he's seeking he goes a little mad. And he's seeking almost like, how do I make up for the guilt that I have, right? And this kind of imitates, in a sense, what we see with the conversion scene in the Damascus episode. But then the very place where Orestes goes and is on trial is at the Areopagus. And Athena is the final voter. And it's literally equal. Like, condemn him, he's innocent. Athena gives the final verdict. And of course, he ends up being acquitted of all charges. And in the debate, Orestes brings up something about resurrection. And Apollo, I believe it was, that said, no, once the body has become dust in the earth, there is no anastasis. There's no resurrection. And you see in Acts 17, now he gets into the Greek, and I don't know the languages like that, but he points out that it is lifting and it's reversing all that we see in the earlier play. And I thought, it seems so obvious that there's something going on here.
Yeah, that sounds like a really solid case. And Luke is known to imitate things. There's this scholar, Courtney Friesen, who has argued, and many scholars besides him have, that Luke imitates Dionysiac myth throughout in order to sort of draw a comparison and even make a sort of competitive claim against Dionysus. And especially in Dionysus's myth as it's preserved in like Euripides. And so he's done work on that. I've also done work on Luke imitating the myth of Philemon and Baucis in Acts chapter 14. That's preserved at least in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Some scholars argue that maybe Luke is working with like a Greek version of that story, but who knows? In any case, it's a pre-existent story, and he seems to be imitating it for sure.
What is it? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. So
where exactly is that episode? And explain that.
Yeah, for sure. So, So it's the story of Philemon and Baucis.
I know that story, but for the audience, maybe we should tell them.
Right. Yeah. So this is a old married couple, and they live in the region, I think it's Lycaonia. And Ovid in his book The Metamorphoses tells the story of how the gods Zeus and Hermes came down from heaven and visited 1,000 different houses in this region. and no one would give them hospitality. No one would give them a place to stay because they were disguised as poor beggars. And they finally arrive at the house of Philemon and Baucis, and they knock on the door, and they show them hospitality. They let them in their house. They let them stay. They cook a meal for them. And while they're cooking a meal for them and they're trying to feed them food, they notice they're not eating. They seem a little off. Something's going on, and they discern, oh, you know what? We think these actually might be gods. And at that moment, Zeus and Hermes reveal themselves to this old married couple, and they say, yes, indeed, we are gods. And so they say, you guys are the only ones who showed us hospitality. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to flood and destroy all of the rest of the people who refuse to show us hospitality, and we're going to honor you too by deifying you and making you into gods. In Acts 14 portrays Paul and Barnabas going into that same region of the world. When they get there, as strangers, they go into the city of Lystra or Lystra, and immediately the people come out and they proclaim, who are they? They're, of course, Zeus and Hermes. And so they go to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas as Zeus and Hermes, and Paul says, no, we're not Zeus and Hermes. Please stop. They restrain them from sacrificing, and Paul gives a little sermonette, a little sermon, short one. And he says, the God that we've come to proclaim is the God who causes it to rain on the just and the unjust. And this rain doesn't destroy everybody, right? Like in Ovid's story. Instead, what the rain does is it produces fruits and seasons and gives life to people. And so Paul draws a contrast here between the story of Philemon and Baucis and their own situation. And so Luke he's imitating this story, but he's doing exactly what I think you were describing, Bilby arguing, that he inverts the story to sort of make a theological point that God's not going to do the kinds of things that Zeus is doing in the story, that our God is better than yours ultimately.
I think that's awesome. I think there's so many places we could look to for that example, right? Or those kinds of examples. The Philemon and Baucis one, I found interesting parallels to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And in fact, there's some scholars who actually have done some work on this, where they think that Jews in that region, sometime in the 3rd century BCE, during the Hellenistic period, would have come or crossed cultures, and maybe somehow the Philemon Baucis story, and there's like a mix going on where they saw this, because it's like you said, it's a Xenia hospitality myth, and we have the same problem with Sodom and Gomorrah. Is they're the inhospitality, but also there's also in Ovid's Fasti this strange 3 divine men appear, and it's a weird one because he's like the guy, his wife dies and he doesn't have a son. Weird how he doesn't wish back for his wife so that he could just have a child. But then the gods do something, and Ovid says, I cannot say, it's too profane to describe, as you mentioned in your book, that only elite people would ever be aware of or educated on that higher level. But they must have done something weird to this cow hide, and it ends up giving him a son. And it's 3 divine beings instead of just 2. Whereas 2 show up in Sodom and Gomorrah, but 3 appear to Abraham in the very prior episode. And so there's been a lot of work on that connecting and stuff too. So I'm like, wow. But I never really put those 2 together with Luke Acts.
Yeah. It's been in the sort of commentary tradition for a while that a lot of scholars will refer to it, but they just don't make much of it. And if you actually read the 2 stories in tandem, then it produces a lot of really interesting and generative, exegesis. But yeah, on the point that you were just making about Ovid and his work, like there's a lot of overlap between Ovid and the biblical tradition. I mean, from the Great Flood to the Sodom and Gomorrah story to what we find in Metamorphoses and Acts, like there is a great deal of, I'm going to use the term overlap between these 2, similarity at the very least. that seems to suggest that they're playing around with different kinds of traditions and myths and traditional stories from way back in the ancient Near East that ends up permeating even the Greco-Roman civilizations. So I think that the way that we need to think about cultural influence is not just that Christianity is influenced by Judaism and its Greco-Roman environment, but that the Greco-Roman environment is influenced by its ancient Near Eastern environment as well. So these things are, and the ancient Near East is being influenced by ancient Greece. And so these ideas are permeating at a and intermixing at a very, very early stage. And so drawing the lines of connections genealogically is really difficult, but it can produce some interesting results. I mean, at the end of the day, we find out that the Samson story does look a lot like certain Greek stories. And if you look at some really old myths, I keep coming back to Heracles, but there's so much out there about him. There's a lot in common with those stories. And so, yeah, we find a lot of cultural exchange going on really, really early. And I think that we've really underappreciated it, and trying to keep the New Testament just in one particular environment isn't going to work for a lot of reasons.
Real quick comment about what I brought up earlier with Orestes. He dies by a snake bite in the end. And I kind of wondered if you had any input on what you thought was going on Malta with Paul being bit. Of course, we know the long version of Mark seems to be nodding at this, and fundamentalists are playing with rattlesnakes in South Carolina. But, that's my neck of the woods. That's where I'm like, North Carolina really is where I mostly grew up. But, yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see any other myths that you thought were really cool that are imitated?
Oh yeah, so you mentioned Litwa earlier, and he's identified the myth of oh man, I'm gonna forget his name. Bit on the foot. Oh man, I can't remember his name. But this hero from the Odyssey who's bit on the foot and by a snake and just suffers for a long time on this island by himself, and ends up in great pain and ends up dying from the snake bite, I believe. I don't think it gets healed. So he's compared it to that story. But I think there's snakes often are associated with those who are divine. This happens frequently in the ancient world. And one of the figures who is able to be bitten by a snake and survive is actually Pythagoras. And so there's this tradition that Pythagoras was once bit by a viper, and that he grabbed the viper and bit it back, and the viper ended up dying from his bite rather than him from the snake bite. And I've always thought that was like a sort of funny comparand with Paul in Malta, because Paul's bit by the snake, he takes it and he shakes it off into the fire, and Paul ends up being fine, ends up getting acclaimed as a god, but the snake ends up dying. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on in Acts 28 in particular, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are echoes of Orestes in that passage as well.
I think that's a comment I made from just doing a little research after reading their article. I don't know if they mentioned it in their article. I just thought that's interesting. But again, yeah, there could be who knows how many stories, and it could be a generic nod to that common literary world. And that's another thing, the generic aspect. Then there are models, I think. And I think the debate that happened, and I'm sure you're well aware of, between like Dennis MacDonald, who takes more of a literary mimesis approach, versus the cultural mimesis, which is the Litwa, which is more in line with Jonathan Z. Smith. I don't think it's either or. I think both are taking place. And this is just where I'm coming from. I think it's unfortunate if we think, we shouldn't try to make genetic. No, you should. And I don't think there's any sin act happening here, attempting to make a genetic one. But also considering that, hey, there's no way without like really ancient voices saying this is what they did. Some of it is a bit artistic on our behalf of our interpretation. So we have to be cautious as well to know there might be another model that makes better sense of it or something. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here with you because your book taps into this.
Yeah, no doubt. And the book doesn't do so much of that sort of genetic literary imitation stuff as just that larger cultural imitation within the stream of Litwa, and maybe Robin Faith Walsh. But yeah, I agree. I think both can be done. It seems to me that it's slightly harder to make an argument that one text is dependent upon another text, and so I just don't do it in the book. But it's certainly possible. And in fact, in my first book, I do make the case that that the author of Acts is dependent upon certain particular sources and particular texts, and is innovating upon them. Sometimes almost even satirizing them, but that is a form of imitation in and of itself.
Yeah. Okay, so as far as divinity is concerned, here I took us off a bit into mythic stuff because it's it's what I do. The debate that happens. How does your model correct this? Does it just allow more spaghetti to be thrown at the wall and then explain it? And then maybe, I don't know if you cover this, I'm not sure because I haven't gotten all the way to the bottom of the book yet. Does your model, it also help lay good groundwork for the later Trinitarian material or that kind of philosophy for Christ? I mean, do you think that what you're bringing to the table brings in enough extra models of divinity that kind of gives the Christian conception of Trinitarianism or forms of it that I know there's like subordination forms of it, things like that? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in chapter, I think like 2 of my book, I tackled the topic of divinity. And the interesting thing about studies of Christology is that most scholars don't actually talk about what they think divinity is. They just assume a category and move on. But scholars assume all sorts of different kinds of categories of what divinity is, what constitutes divinity. So you have one school of thought, which is that divinity is ultimately just status. Gods are the kinds of things that human beings are. They just have a higher status and maybe they have a little bit more power. But ultimately, they're just on a sliding scale of being. And I think I just don't think that's quite right. Gods seem to be different kinds of things than human beings. And so there's another school of thought that argues, no, it's not status, it's ontology. It is the nature of one's being. And this nature of one's being enables you to have certain kinds of characteristics, to do certain kinds of things. And I think, yeah, there's some stuff to that. But I ultimately think at the end of the day, and maybe I'm just totally off base, that divinity is is something that is characterized by a number of different qualities. And some of them are ontological. So those qualities are power, immortality, status, and honor. So I think those 4 things are the kinds of things that the ancient persons looked for when they were looking for a god. Or when they saw a god, those are the kinds of things that they associated with a god. So power. A god's power can manifest in a lot of different ways. That's why there are certain gods that are over, agriculture, and there are certain gods that are over the ocean. Certain gods have certain kinds of powerful domains. And so there's different kinds of power. There's power for ruling, there's power for healing, there's power of the intellect. There's all kinds of different powers that an individual could possess that would sort of be divine power. Then there's immortality. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Gods usually don't die. Sometimes they do in the myth, but sometimes they come back to life. Then there is status. And status confers certain kinds of things. One is that gods don't just have one kind of status. There's not just God and all the gods fit into that category. You have different types of gods, and different types of gods have different levels of power. They have different kinds of eternality. So there are certain gods that don't come into being, and then there are other gods that have come into being. And those things confer different types of status to those different types of gods. So, for instance, you have angels in the Jewish and Christian tradition, and you have daimones in the Greco-Roman tradition. And those are kinds of beings that may have come into being at some point, may have been created, but nonetheless have immortality. They have a power in excess of humanity. They have a kind of status because they can be worshipped in Greco-Roman religion. Plenty of people worship daimones. In Jewish tradition, plenty of people are told not to worship angels. And that suggests to me that probably there are some people who are. So these are the kinds of beings who can be worshipped, but they're created beings. But then you have beings that are above them, that are over them in rank. And for the Greeks, you have the 12 Olympians. For the Jews, you have the high god. Maybe in certain strains of Judaism, there are other gods in that cosmos too. But these gods are over the lower level deities, and so they have a different kind of status. And then finally, degrees of honor. You are only supposed to give human beings a certain amount of honor, or a certain kind of honor in the ancient Mediterranean world. And if you exceed certain amounts of honor and certain kinds of honor, if you give to a human the honor that's owed to a god, that god's going to get angry and punish that human being. And so we have an example of that in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 12, we have Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa goes before the people of Tyre and Sidon, and he's given like sanctions over them and basically gone to war with these people who are essentially his subjects. And so they're asking for peace. And so they go to him and they try to essentially kiss his butt. They try to get on his good side by acclaiming him as a god and not a man. And that's honor that's not due to him because he's not a god. In fact, he is a man. And so God gets angry, God gets jealous, and so God punishes him by making him get eaten by worms, right? A pretty brutal death. And this kind of thing happens a lot in ancient Greco-Roman literature, if you look for it. And so you can only give a certain level of honor to humans, and you're supposed to give a higher level to heroes, and you're supposed to give a higher level to daimones, and you're supposed to give an even higher level to God or the gods. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we should be looking for when we're talking about divinity. So it's status, yes, but it's not just status. It's ontology, yes, but it's not just ontology. It's all of these things put together that make a person a god. And I've been going on for a while, but
I love it.
mention this. Yeah. I'll mention this one other thing. So does that lead us to Trinitarianism? It's moving us along the way, I think. Not the idea of divinity per se, but the way that Luke uses it. And I think the way that Luke moves us towards a kind of Trinitarianism is in something that he does in calling Jesus Lord in particular. So Lord is the title for God in the Old Testament, but it's also a title that Greco-Roman rulers would get. It's a title that the Caesar would get. And so Luke is drawing on all of these different threads and weaving them together. And he's characterizing Jesus' lordship as the kind of thing that rulers in the Greek world and Caesar in the Roman world have. And if we study rulers in the Greek world and Caesar in the Roman world, how did human beings conceptualize them? They conceptualize them as divine human beings. They are figures who have a kind of divinity. They are one of those levels on that ontological ladder of being, but they're closer to the God side than the human side. And so they merit divine worship. Sometimes they even merit prayers. Certain of those people get temples. And so you're expected to sacrifice them. You're expected to treat them like a god, with all kinds of caveats among the people in the city of Rome. But nonetheless, generally speaking, most people regarded the Caesar as a human god. And I argue in the book that Luke does a lot of the same kind of work to Jesus by characterizing him as Lord or Kurios. But he also, and this is something that a lot of scholars who have looked at Luke's Jewish context have noticed, he also links him really closely with the God of Israel. Well, this is actually something we see happen to Greco-Roman rulers and the Roman Caesar. These individuals will often be closely associated with one of the gods in heaven through something called assimilation. And so Caligula starts walking around dressing like Heracles and wants people to call him that. Mark Antony and many of the Ptolemies, they want to go around and start being called Bacchus or Dionysus. They consider themselves to be linked to that god. And Plutarch goes out of his way to say that, well, when Mark Antony ends up, dying, what happens? Dionysus abandons him. Right? So it's as though Dionysus really was with him, that his presence really was there. But because Mark Antony is kind of a jerk, Dionysus is like, this guy's kind of a loser. I don't want to be associated with him anymore. He does abandon him, and he ends up getting killed. And so these rulers can be associated with a high god, and Luke does do that to Jesus. He associates him or assimilates him to the Jewish God in a way reminiscent of the kinds of things we find in this larger Mediterranean world. And so I do think that is one of the trajectories that leads us towards a Trinitarianism. Yeah. Luke's not a Trinitarian yet, because no one's a Trinitarian yet. It takes a lot of philosophical developments to get us to Nicaea, to get us to consubstantiality and hypostases and all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, Luke is pushing us in that direction by closely identifying Jesus with the God of Israel.
Yeah, I think there's even the concept that Augustus was actually Apollo incarnate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Incarnate.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the idea that Christ is incarnate, and that there's this pre-existent material that we talk about, logo stuff. I mean, come on, something's going on. And I think looking for that model within the Greco-Roman world is important. I did an interesting video on this issue. So I like the way you're thinking about this. So, okay, let's talk about ascension and resurrection for a moment. I know this is the touchy subject, but I think this is one of my favorites, is just seeing Jesus float up into a cloud. Let's just start with ascension for a moment. Mm-hmm. And, of course, you could even look at the transfiguration scene as a form of a connection to what happens in Acts chapter 1. Mm-hmm. But Romulus or these other divinities that ascend, or demigod heroes that ascend to divine status, you've, I'm sure, on that same track, think that this is definitely in that same vein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. And yeah, I mean, there's the famous stories of Romulus. And there's a lot of scholars out there that want to say, hey, look, Jesus's ascension and his resurrection from the dead, they have nothing to do, and his post-resurrection appearances too, have nothing to do with these Greco-Roman parallels. No matter how many parallels there might seem to be between Jesus and Romulus, right? Especially with Romulus, because he's got the appears after he's dead and his ascent into heaven, and is from now on you need to worship me. Like, you have all of those things with Romulus. So they're fascinating parallels. People will say, no, this doesn't work because Jesus' resurrection is physical. Those people haven't read very widely in the sources, because if they had, then they would have read a book about heroes called Heroicus by Philostratus. And Philostratus describes a hero, Protesilaus, who his bones are still in the grave, but he himself has resurrected from the dead and is physical, so that one of the characters in the stories is able to ride on his shoulders like a little kid, who's able to be hugged and kissed by this guy he's not. And this is very explicitly, one of the characters asks this guy, he says, is he like in Homer's Odyssey, where Achilles tries to grab after Patroclus, but Patroclus is just like mist. He can't grab him. He's like a little ghost. And he goes, no, not at all. It's not like that. He kisses me on the face. He carries me on his shoulders. He lets me hug him and embrace him. I ride piggyback on his back, right? You have all of these. That sounds like the kind of thing we have with the resurrection story with Jesus. And so that's a fact. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're not, we have that evidence. We've got to do something with it. And so to say that a hero is someone who just ascends spiritually isn't right, because we have this hero in a book called Heroicus that describes this guy being physical. If you even read, again, to go back to Ovid, because you got to love some Ovid. Ovid describes Heracles ascending, and it says when he ascends to heaven, that Atlas, who's holding the world on his shoulders, and heaven specifically is on his back, he felt Heracles's pondus, his weight. Like that means that Heracles has a physical weight for Atlas to be able to feel it. It's not like his importance or his grandeur. It's his physical weight. And that checks out with later claims about seeing Heracles come and touch people or kill people physically. And so these early texts, they're just not as clear cut as a lot of scholars want them to be. They want them to be, oh no, it has nothing to do with Christianity. It looks nothing like Christianity. But the problem is it does. And it's not just scholars who see that today, like me, like Litwell, like Miller. It's also ancient people. Ancient people also saw the similarity here. And so in my book, I have a history of reception. What did early Christians say about the resurrection narratives? And you alluded to Justin's first apology earlier. And what does he say? He says, we say nothing different than what you have described about those who are called sons of Zeus. And one of the things that he talks about there is Dionysus being torn to shreds, but then coming back to life. And these other people who are ostensibly, or not ostensibly, but clearly killed, but then brought back to life, heroized, become a god. And so Justin embraces it, at least when he's talking to Greeks. He resists it a little bit when he's talking to Trypho the Jew, but nonetheless, early Christians do make connections with these stories. And so I don't think they're totally artificial. We can still say that Luke doesn't have to be drawing on any particular story for those parallels to obtain, but nonetheless, it's not totally artificial. Early Christians were seeing this as well, and they were trying to reckon with it.
I love that, and I hope everybody reads that. I love that you get into the reception, because you're right. Many Christians beyond Justin do the parallel game, and they see it. And for different reasons, they might have different explanations. It's not always demons long ago. Yeah. There are other reasons that are being brought up. But your point about that, I never heard about that story. I really want to dive into that. And do you know what page that's on in your book that you cover that, or do you not cover that particular example? And
which example?
The one with the bones are still in the grave, but the guy's physical.
Yeah. I'll have to look that up and tell you after the show.
Let me know. We'll do a follow-up episode on that, or I'll comment it and pin it at the top so that people who buy the book can go there. Because James Tabor, actually, I had a fascinating discussion with him, and he comes straight out of the Jonathan Z. Smith vein, very close friends of him and his wife. And James says, he is reading Paul's 1 Corinthians 15 in a way where he could see Paul really not caring if Jesus's body was over here in the tomb or not, that he's given a whole new glorified body. So he doesn't necessarily die on the hill that it must be this, but he's like, when I'm reading this, he has a pneumatic body now. It's not like you could find the bones over here, and these early Christians would have likely not bat an eye and said, no, he has a glorified body now. He's been given something different from what is now over here, those bones you're describing or whatnot. And of course, there's different, just like you say, divinities, there's different conceptions of that. It seems like there's different conceptions of how to negotiate with the deified figure. The body goes missing with the translation fable trope. But anyway, like, how do we deal with this? So resurrection, I'd like to ask you, if we bring the Mediterranean world, and this is the hot button, holy moly, put your big boy pants on topic. Maybe not for you and me, but like a lot of the viewers who are coming from a more, this stuff is sacred and extremely carefully, you got to walk this with a tightrope. For me, I see so many examples, no Xerox story that is copying. That's the unfortunate straw man that exists online. But what Mediterranean models would you say are really good examples of resurrection for Jesus? Because we've been told, and I think there's something to it, resurrection is a Jewish idea, at least the apocalyptic eschatological resurrection concept that we see. So how do you marry those two, and what Mediterranean models come in to explain the narratives that we have with Paul and the Gospels?
Yeah, great question. I think we have several different strands of thought coming together when early Christians are talking about resurrection. I think they're marrying Jewish apocalyptic eschatology and the expectation of the general resurrection with the personal resurrection of Jesus, which I think even in Paul, they are describing using the language of heroification narratives, like of Heracles, like of Romulus, like of certain emperors as well. And so I think you have both of those strands happening simultaneously. And there's a tension there, and we could work that tension out. But I don't think that they're totally irreconcilable. I do think that Paul, for instance, is probably a consistent thinker about resurrection here. I don't think he's taking two totally different strands and putting them together. I think they can be, combinable. But in any case, he certainly combines them. In terms of like what specific examples I think come closest to what we find, I think we have to differentiate between Paul and the Gospels, because Paul, he doesn't have an empty tomb narrative. So Tabor, as you say, sounds like he doesn't think that Paul does have any kind of idea of an empty tomb. Jesus' body may be still down there. And I sort of see a way of reading that. I think that he probably does think that Jesus' body is raised from, like, physically raised from the dead, because of the whole sowing and sprouting metaphor that he describes. But in any case, he doesn't describe the sort of coming out of the ground, coming out of the tomb scenario in the way that the Gospels and Acts do. And in those texts, I think the closest comparands that we can find are specifically transferal narratives or heroification narratives, where you find an empty tomb. So there's Richard C. Miller is like 90 or something examples of this. Some are really close, some are not as close. To Mark's gospel, one of the closest examples that we have is in Caratone's book, Carius and Calaroe, which is a little romance story about a guy who, it's like a domestic violence situation. He kicks his wife in the chest because he thinks she's cheating on her. And she looks like she's died. And so they put her into a tomb. And then he feels really guilty. So he goes to the tomb, sort of like a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. And he's going to kill himself. But then he sees that the tomb is empty. And he thinks, as soon as he sees the empty tomb, he doesn't think people have robbed the grave, which is what's actually happened in the story.
Yeah.
He doesn't think people have robbed the grave. He doesn't think that, oh, she just woke up from a coma and walked out. He thinks this woman was a god. I didn't realize I had a god for a wife this entire time. And so I think that kind of thing, that kind of thought is exactly what Mark wants you to have when you encounter the empty tomb. You're supposed to be afraid because you didn't know the entire, like the women who run away from the tomb. You're supposed to be afraid because you didn't know the entire time you were hanging out with a god. And that's a scary thing because that can be dangerous. In Luke's version, I think one of the closest accounts is what we find with Romulus. And I think that Luke has been drawing a contrast between Jesus and the kingdom that he proclaims and the political situation that he finds himself in the Roman Empire. And so I do think that he's probably playing a little bit with some of those Romulus traditions about Romulus appearing after his death, condemning people who ended up killing him, saying, "You got to worship me," and then ascending into heaven. And they start a new cult from there. Because when is Jesus worshipped for the first and only time in the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts? It's in Luke chapter 24. After he's appeared to his disciples and he ascends into heaven. And so this ascension marks the appropriate time to start worshiping Jesus, because we know that he lives in heaven and is a God and is able to dispense benefactions to us as a result. And so I think the closest parallels are probably like Romulus, and then in terms of like his physicality, probably something like what we find with Philostratus's Heroicus, where we have this physical individual who is raised from the dead and is able to engage with his followers. So I don't know of one single parallel that does exactly what we find in the Gospels, but you shouldn't expect to find one that's exactly the same. We find many that are similar. And so, yeah, I think Luke is participating in a larger, to use Wittgenstein's term, a language game, describing Jesus as a kind of divine being like the divine heroes.
I think what shocked me the most when I was reading Miller's work on resurrection and reception was when he catalogs all these things you're describing, right? And then turns around and goes, "Oh, you thought I was finished? Well, guess what? There are Roman road appearances after Caesar's died." And I'm like, hold on. Post-mortem appearances after they've been deified, ascended off, or had already become gods in heaven and whatnot. And they're appearing to people on Roman roads. And so I'm just like right back to like the Emmaus story and stuff. And but I know you probably have read Bruce Loudon to some degree, or you've heard of him maybe. He did an interesting article where he thinks that there's a dialogic relationship between Luke, the Emmaus story, and Odyssey 1, where Telemachus is running from the suitors, and he's there with his mentor, who is Athena in disguise, but he thinks it's a guy or whatever. And then he mentioned something like, "Man, if I could only have the favor of the gods like my father did when he was away at war." And Athena, disguised as the mentor, says to Telemachus, as a pun on his name, says, because his name means like fighting from afar or something, Telemachos. And the pun was something like, "Even the gods can help you from afar, fighter from afar." The name, which is fictive, plays into the pun. And so this is what Loudon saw with Cleopas. And he said, Cleopas meaning glory of the Father. And so Jesus has to correct Cleopas on the road and says, "Listen, we thought he was the Messiah and he was supposed to come and do this thing." And he goes, "Well, didn't you know, Mr. Glory of the Father, that he had to do all these things in order to be glorified with the Father?" It's some pun that's so interesting. And I was like, where have I been? I was taught all of this to be read literally like there's a certain pair of glasses on how we're supposed to read this material. So that leads me to one question. Feel free to comment on that. I guess my last question for this episode, because my golly, I mean, I'd love to have you collab with other academics. I know I can already hear the praise in their head for the work you did and really helping get your name out there. But like, I'd like to do a follow-up and dive deeper into the materials of this book. Final question I have is historicity. This obviously is one of those hot subjects, but it's an issue because when you see creative liberty by an author to imitate, to model artistically, as Carl Olof Sandnes said in a recent discussion, the only one historically that's happened publicly between Dennis MacDonald and him, and that was when imitation happens or a model like this is occurring, it puts a distance between what happened and what's being written. So there's a chasm. And how far is that chasm, right? So how do we marry historicity and myth? Someone like Miller might say, and he's already critiqued the classicists who try to do this with narratives about Alexander the Great and others. He says, if you're trying to find the guy, as if we just do Thomas Jefferson and scalpel out the miracles, the guy's just going to come out of the text, oh, what's not miracle is what happened. But that doesn't seem to be, like David Friedrich Strauss would say, like, it's contaminated with myth. We don't know where history and myth meet. How do you not even attempt to try and figure out what actually happened? How do you resolve this dilemma?
Yeah, no, it's a really hard one. And it's not easy. And I mean, the same dilemma obtains when we think about the use of the Old Testament and constructing or imitating scenes in light of Old Testament narratives that New Testament authors love to do. And so that's not a question that we can escape by going back to the Judaism Hellenism divide either.
Right.
So it's a question for all New Testament scholars, I think. And it's really not easy. On the one hand, you could say, you could go with Sandness, and you could say, because the authors have constructed a scene in light of a literary predecessor, that gives you a distance between the mere fact of the event and the way that it's presented, because it's constructed in light of this other thing. But on the other hand, sometimes individuals did actually model their life after other individuals, right? And so Dale Allison, in his new book, I can't remember the name of it.
This one? Yeah. Interpreting Jesus?
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, you probably know where I'm going with this. So
yes, sir.
You have what is it, Simeon the Stylite, or Simon the Stylite, who models his life after Moses very deliberately, right? He tries to fast for 40 days and 40 nights, and he fails on multiple occasions before he's able to try to actually achieve that. And so there are individuals who through history do try to imitate others. I'll give you one example that I love to think with, and that's Peregrinus. Is his name Proteus Peregrinus?
Yeah,
I think Proteus Peregrinus. Lucian talks about him. Peregrinus really wanted to be perceived as divine, right? He's going around, he's claiming to do miracles, he's trying to trick Christians, he's doing all sorts of things. And at the end of his life, he ends up jumping into a volcano in order to
he jumped on a pyre.
Oh, that's it. He jumps on a pyre. Yeah. Sorry, I'm conflating him with Empedocles. Yep. So he goes on a pyre to imitate Heracles, right? He even ends up killing himself. And afterwards, you have people who perceive him to have appeared because Lucian starts a rumor, right? He's like, oh, I saw him appear. And then other people say, no, we saw him appear too. And so did those people think they saw him appear? It is very possible that they did think that they saw him appear. Likewise, it's possible that that the followers of Romulus really thought they saw him appear. And so I think it's equally possible that the followers of Jesus did too, right? And so the question of historicity ultimately gets us to the question, I think, of experience, right? What did people experience? And beyond that, I don't know how much we can say as historians, right. What people experienced, what they didn't experience. We can just say that they thought that they did. And I do think probably early Christians certainly thought that they experienced Jesus. And so regardless of how Luke narrates the historicity of the resurrection, certainly there are people who believed him to be resurrected. But Luke still describes it in ways using culturally coded symbols that evoke a larger literary frame of reference that reminds us of these other heroes. So regardless of whether other people actually had experiences of this, Luke's literary depiction still evokes the kinds of heroification narratives that we find with Heracles, with Proteus Peregrinus, with Protesilaus, with Romulus, and many, many more.
Okay, that's there's so much. My only comment would be Carl Olaf Sandnes brought up examples of signs prophets, right? Where people were modeling themselves after Joshua or Moses, it seems. Some interpret that in Josephus. They think these people were purposefully trying to imitate. You brought up earlier people dressing and behaving like Romulus or Dionysus. Some of these people imitated the gods so much that they actually behave and would have processions. I know that Mark Antony and Cleopatra had a procession into Ephesus, and people were dancing and singing like the Maenads as centaurs and all that. So there is that. What I read, I guess it's like an assumption for me that's a plausible explanation, but in my mind, I'm like, the narratives are so well crafted that if there was people behind them that literally imitated and they made a really interesting story, right? It just still creates more of a gap for me, because if I had like Jesus attempted to do this and it didn't work and then he tried that again, it seemed more plausible to me on the historicity side of going, okay, there were attempts, like, see, but he's like too good to be true from beginning to end for me, right? And I'm just saying, like, that too good to be true sounds like well crafted, right? Very well constructed. And anyway, I like to play with the historicity question, and I hope you don't mind that question. But we have a few Q&A questions, if that's okay, from the audience.
Yeah. Let's go.
And don't go anywhere after the stream. When we get the outro, I want to connect with you before we go. And dude, this has been, I love this, by the way, and I hope you're enjoying yourself.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely a blast.
Good. Daniel Kyle, thank you for being a member and super chatting. Do you think that prophets and prophecy were used as a way to insert polemics and historical national identity as a way to hold dogmatic claims?
Yes. I think that was done frequently. And I would assume that this is probably talking about early Jews and early Christians, but this is also true of prophecy in Egypt and prophecy in Greek and in Rome. Figures are constantly using prophetic claims, like things happened, someone proclaimed this in the past in order to justify belief about something in the present. So this is a very widespread phenomenon. It's such a widespread phenomenon that there's a term for it in biblical studies, and it's called Vaticinium ex eventu, or prophecy after the fact, to justify someone's belief in something or other. So yeah, it's very common trope. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, again, thank you. Says, thought on formation of different Jewish factions. Was it Judaisms? Did Yahwism survive? Did the Hellenistic times birth the Essenes and miracle workers?
Yeah, that's several different questions there. But yeah, I do think that probably it is the crisis of Hellenism that causes a lot of the split within Judaism as a whole. If you look back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they seem to be really concerned with this rupture that happened in the temple. And if we try to coordinate that with what's described in the books of the Maccabees, it seems like the high priesthood was forced out of the temple and of authority in the temple and replaced with Jason, the high priest, and that causes a lot of problems for a lot of Jews. And when the Maccabees take it back over themselves and make themselves priest kings, that causes many problems as well. But I do think that these different sects of Judaism are still Judaism, and I certainly think that they are a form of Yahwism. But Yahwism, I think, is probably more expansive than what we call Judaism, because you have people who venerate Yahweh down in Elephantine, way back in at least the 4th century BC. And you also have in like the 4th century CE, people who are using Yahweh's name as an invocation, especially in like the Greek magical papyri. And so I would want to say, from the perspective of ancient Mediterranean religion, that even the Greek magical papyri represent a type of Yahwism as well. So I think Yahwism continues, not so much in Elephantine, but at least in the different forms of Judaism, in the syncretic Greek magical papyri, and even in Christianity. So I think that those are the different streams of Yahwism as they continue throughout history. And then from there are different forms that emerge as well.
Thank you. Daniel Kyle says, does the different tiers of angels reflect gods?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I do think that certain Jewish and Christian constructions of the angelic hierarchy mirrors that of the pantheons of the larger Greco-Roman world. And even before that, of like the Hittite world. And so, yeah, you have all sorts of constructions of levels of divine beings that today we call angels, but in the Hebrew Bible, they have tons of different words for them. So you have cherubim, you have seraphim, you have ruhot, spirits, you have malachim, messengers that we now translate as angels. And by the time of the Septuagint, all of these different beings get wrapped up into angels, and they all have different levels, and some of them are really weird looking, and some of them look like human beings. And I think those reflect different levels on that sort of heavenly hierarchy. And that reflects originally ancient Near Eastern constructions of gods, but by the time of the New Testament, I think you even have that sort of thing reflecting Greek and Roman constructions of heavenly hierarchies. Yeah.
I think my favorite example is the Deuteronomy 32:8 or 32 section where El Elyon is parting the nations, and how the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a Septuagint version, we have the Masoretic, and you can kind of see that change where they're like, hold on, gods? No. Let's call them sons of Israel here, and let's change down here. They cut out like a few verses in the original. And the later Masoretic, of course, just goes off of the Septuagint angels version, but there was an earlier where they were called gods, and probably conceived in some way as divinities, not just, I guess, how we today would perceive angels. They had a different way of viewing them, I imagine. So,
oh yeah, definitely. And that's I mean, that is a fascinating textual variant because it shows that sometimes, reconstructions, we can actually dig something up out of the ground and prove that they're true. Because at one point, all we had was the Masoretic text, which was God divided the nations according to the number of the sons of the children of Israel. But in the Septuagint, it's according to the number of the sons of the angels, or the angels of God. And so scholars thought, well, normally when the Septuagint has angels, it's sons of God. And so when we dig up the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's exactly what we find. That this term for angels refers in the Hebrew originally to sons of God, which is a sort of term for a pantheon or lower level divinities. Yeah.
Thank you. Two more here. GD, thank you for the super chat. Did Phoenician colonization in parts of the Greek world and Mediterranean at large lay the groundwork for Jewish diaspora and prime the local population via myths for a later Christian message?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. It very well could have. My sort of reconstruction of Jewish diaspora is my sense is that it's primarily the Babylonian and Greek empires, Babylonian, Persian, and Greek empires that sort of create the conditions for movement across the globe. But yeah, I'd have to read a lot more about Phoenician colonization to be able to answer that question intelligently.
Thank you, GD. And then last, Daniel Kyle again says, and thank you, Daniel, for all the super chats. Thoughts on a Holy Spirit? What did Old Testament Jews think it was? Was it the same nature as God? Was it a feminine aspect? Thoughts on anointing oil and Holy Spirit reception?
Yeah, good question. So I don't think that there's a single idea of the Holy Spirit throughout the Old Testament. I think there are different ideas. And this idea of the Spirit, the Hebrew word being ruach, it's like with the Greek pneuma. It's associated not just with the spirit or the power of God, but also with like invisible movements like wind. And so for that reason, ruach is sometimes translated as wind in different Bible versions, conservative Bible versions, liberal Bible, whatever. So all kinds of people translate that. That's not a contested fact. But in terms of the way that the Old Testament understands the Spirit of God, they don't have a strong sense of the personhood of the Spirit like Christians do. They see it more as the power of God, that God can like lend to people in certain amounts, and other individuals can have other amounts of that power. So an instance of this is Elijah and Elisha. So Elijah and Elisha both have the Spirit of God, but Elisha ends up having a double portion of that Spirit of God. So you can have amounts of that Spirit as though it's a sort of like fluid. And that sort of fluid metaphor makes it kind of sense, because the way that we talk about the reception of the Spirit, even in the New Testament, is being filled with the Spirit. And you have that same metaphor in the Old Testament. So it's not fluid, but it's conceived as fluid-like. So it's not exactly a person, does contain God's power. You can identify God as at work in those places, but it takes quite a bit of development to get to this later Trinitarian thought that we have, where we think of the Spirit as a person and acting independently of God the Father, who sends it onto people.
Yeah, pouring out his Spirit. That's pouring.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Okay. Look, ladies and gentlemen, I think we did more than give you an appetizer. I mean, we legitimately dug into some deep, deep material. This is the book, Jesus and Other Sons of God. I hope everybody grabs a copy. You won't miss it. I swear this is more than just a one-time read. This is like a reference source you can constantly go back to. It's footnoted really well. It's got a lot of material in here to help you reference. You're going to want to use this in your dialogues with your friends online if you're ever engaged in anything in relation to this kind of material. And I plan on doing more in diving into Acts, Luke, all this cool stuff that I love to get into. So get you a copy on Amazon. Follow him on academia. Check out the website. He's a professor here. And so is there anything you'd like to say? Last words from you before we go.
Yeah, I mean, thanks a lot for plugging the book, Derek, for having me on. It's been a great time talking to you. And yeah, I mean, the best way to get in contact with me or my work is through my academia page. I am regularly posting articles and chapters and that kind of thing that I'm writing. So if you want to keep up with my work, that's a good way to do it. And because of copyright laws, I can't exactly put up the entire article for everything. So if you send me a message, I'd be happy to send you guys what I've got.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, don't miss it. Don't go anywhere, Dr. Glover. I'm gonna end this stream here in just a minute. But I hope that you all are having a wonderful day. And if you're going through some tough times, I do like that whole saying that the sun will rise after the rain, after the dark night. So just stick it out. And I hope you'll take his work serious and go get a copy and join me on this journey of learning more and more about the ancient world. And I appreciate it. So hope you never forget to, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.